friends, welcome to learn Java programming course. Java is one of the high-level programming language. Java is the internet programming language. Java is also a professional programmer's language. Java is one of the a pure object-oriented programming language. There are different high-level programming languages are evolved, right? So in this session, we focus on the history and evolution of Java programming. First, let us see the different high-level languages evolved, right? So far, in 1957, the language Fortran is evolved. Fortran, which stands for Formula Translation. The language Fortran is applied for scientific and engineering purposes. Different scientific and engineering applications are solved initially using the language Fortran. The language Fortran, which was designed by John Backus. Initial version of Fortran is Fortran 77. Then the extension to Fortran 77 is given in version 90. And in the subsequent stages, Fortran 95 is introduced, then Fortran 2003, then Fortran 2008, then the latest version is Fortran 2018. Following the language, high-level language Fortran, in 1958, the language Algol is introduced. The language Algol, right, it stands for algorithmic language. Algol stands for algorithmic language. This is designed by the European and American computer scientists committee in the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, right, in Zurich country. The versions of Algol are Algol 58, right, year version, then Algol 60. These are some important versions of the language Algol. The language Algol, the special feature is this is the first language which supports nested functions. In C language, right, we have discussed nested functions. Calling a function in another function is said to be a nested function. Calling a function inside another function is said to be a nested function. For example, void f1, assuming the definition of void f1 is given here within this opening and closing curly braces. Having some executable statements here, for example, then here we like to call a function f2, right? So whenever a function f1 is called, right, after the complete execution of some sequential statements, then the next statement to be executed is f2, right? So this is simply a function call. Simply calling a function inside another function is said to be a nested function. The language Algol, which supports the block concept, block of code. What is block of code? Some executable statements can be placed right inside a block, right? That is said to be a code block. C, C++ languages support a code block concept. For example, right, if we include right some statements inside this opening and closing curly braces, right, that is said to be a block of code. For loop, right, for right introduces right a block of code. While statements, right, introduces a block of code. Function definition here also, right, void f1, right, this is said to be a block of code. In language Algol, the code block is introduced using the keywords, right, begin, end, begin, then end. So within the region, right, begin and end, right, you need to specify the code block. A Pascal language, right, also supports, right, the code block using the keywords begin, end. Suppose you like to perform, right, some executable statements, right, which are to be executed as block of code, right. You need to specify the statements like this: begin, statement one, then statement two, etc. Statement n. You can place any n executable statements, right, inside this block. Begin, right, opening and closing curly braces, right. Normally, right, in algol, opening and closing curly braces is opening and closing curly braces are replaced by the keywords, right, begin and end. Following algol, right, in 1959, the language COBOL is introduced. COBOL, which stands for Common Business Oriented Language. Common Business Oriented Language, which is mainly applied for it as a mainframe and business oriented applications. The language COBOL, right, which was developed by Codasil, Codasil organization. Then after 1959, right, in 1960s, right, introduce the birth to structured programming. Structured programming. Structured programming, this is one kind of problem solving methodology. Different real world problems can be solved, right, by applying, right, modular programming, where the program is split into different modules, right. A structured programming, right, program is split into different structures or functions, right. Object oriented programming is partitioned into, right, data and functions. In 1960s, right, we have the birth to the structured programming language. Structured programming is a programming which supports three important constructs, right? They are sequence, second one is selection, and the third one is iteration. Sequence, selection, and iteration, right? If a programming language supports these constructs, then the language is said to be a structured programming language. Sequence in the sense that, right, the statements are going to be executed in the sequential order. Suppose S1, S2, S3, right, etc. Sn are the executable statements inside the code. Statement S1 is executed first. After the complete execution of S1, then sequentially S2 is going to be executed. Then following that, the next executable statement S3 is going to be executed. Then following that, right, etc., right, after the complete execution of the statements, finally the nth sequential statement Sn is going to be executed. That is the concept of a sequence. Then selection, right, based on the conditional evaluation, control can be transferred to, right, either a true block statements or a false block statements, right. So better, okay, a selection statement is, right, if statement, if condition, right. Then we have some true block statements block, right, true. Then else we can have false block statements. False block statements. Upon the execution of the condition, right, if the condition results in true, true block statements are executed, right. So selected portions are going to be executed, right. So if the condition results in true, a true block statements alone will get executed. If the condition false, true block statements are skipped, right. Then control goes to execute the false block statements. That is one kind of a selective constructs. If else, right, can also be nested. Another one is iteration, right? Iteration, or another term is, right, repetition. Iteration or repetition, right? Repetitive concepts in structured programming using the for loop, right? for which is said to be the entry controlled programming constructor, right? For while is also the entry controlled programming constructor. Then do while is said to be the exit controlled programming constructor. Then, right, like Pascal language, right, we have uh, iterative construct called repeat until, right? Repeat until, right? Repeats the operation until the condition becomes true. That is the purpose of repeat until. Say repeat S1, right? Then next executable statement say S2, etc. Some n statements are there. Sn. How to close it? Close, repeat, ends with until, then specify the condition, semicolon. Initially, right, or unconditionally, S1, S2, etc., Sn are executed once. Then control goes to test, right, the conditional part. If the condition is false, return, control goes to executor, right? The repeat until block. Repeat until executes, right? Until, right, the condition, until the condition becomes true. Once the condition becomes true, right, control comes out of repeat until and it executes the next executable statement, say statement X, right? So as far as right for while are concerned, right, if the conditional part results in true, then only part of or while, right, gets executed. If the condition becomes false, right, control comes out of the statement, right, comes out of the corresponding block, then it executes the next executable statement, right, in the sequential order. As far as repeat until is concerned, right, repeat until executes some statement block, right, or block of statements until the condition becomes true, right. Or repeat until, right, this is supported in the language, the Pascal language. So just to have an idea, structured programming, right? Any programming language that supports the concepts, sequence, selection, and iteration are said to be a structured programming language. The C is well, right? Of course, a full structured programming language. Even C++, right? A complete, right? Structured as well as object-oriented programming language. So in 1960s, right, the concept of structured programming, right, are introduced. In 1960s, right, another important language that evolved is Simula, which stands for a simulation language. Simulation is nothing but an experimentation, right? In order to do right some, in order to solve some real world problems, we need to have right the large amount of experimentation, right? That can be done with the help of some simulation programming languages. One simulation programming language is Simula, right? This is of course the first object-oriented programming language. This is the important point. The first object-oriented programming language is the Simula. Then in 1964, right, 1964, right, uh, Kemeny and Kutz, right, at Dartmouth College, right, the team of people designed a language, BASIC, right, which stands for Beginners All-Purpose Symbolic Instruction Code. Beginners all-purpose symbolic instruction code. This is a very basic, right, high-level programming language which introduces, right, some a column format, right, statement number, right, then statement, right, 10, 11, 12, 30, right, like that. We need to have statement numbers and the corresponding statements. For example, 10 input A comma B, then 20, right, like that. We can have statement C is equal to A plus B. Then 30, having the statement A into C. 40, stop. 50, end. This is a very basic data program, right, which inputs are two numbers and finds the value, right? Some C is equal to A plus B and prints the value upon C. This basic language, right, supports a construct called goto, right? Goto, right? This is the unconditional control statement, right? Even supported in a language C, right? Goto unconditionally transfers the control, right, to the specific label, right? As far as goto is concerned, right, the label should be defined, right? Here, the label is nothing but a statement number, goto 50, right? So control is going to execute the statement number 50. Following the language basic, right, in 1964, right, then in 1967 next advancement is given in, right, 1967. The corresponding language is BCPL. BCPL, right, which stands for basic combined programming language. Basic combined programming language, which was designed by Martin Richards at Cambridge University. The language, right, basic combined programming language, right, BCPL. This is clearly a procedural, right? Procedural. We can write a procedures, right? We can write structured concepts, right? Procedural and structural programming language. And the language BCPL, right? This is the first programming language, right? Which supports the code block, introducing the concept of opening and closing curly braces, like C++ languages. The code block is first introduced in opening and closing the curly braces. Following this, right, in 1969, the extension to the BCPL language, that is a language B, right, developed at Bell Laboratories, right, developed by, right, Ken Thompson, who designed the language B, right, extending the features of the BCPL. This is used for recursive and some machine-oriented applications. The language is said to be a typeless language. Typeless in the sense that, right, no data type. It supports, right, only one data type, right? So because of that, right, the language is said to be a typeless data type language. So an extension to the language, right, B is next, right, given in, right, 1970. The language 1970, Pascal is introduced. Pascal is said to be a structured programming language. The language supports the concepts. What are they? Sequence, selection, and iteration. So the language which was developed by Nicholas Wirth. Nicholas Wirth, right, designed the language Pascal, right, introducing the concepts of the structured programming, right. Following this in 1970s, after the introduction of structured programming language Pascal, right, the combined features of a BCPL and B are taken. BCPL from a B languages. BCPL and B languages, right? Features are taken, right, to design a new language, right? C, right? The language C is designed by Dennis Rich at Bell Laboratories, right? Later, right, in 1989, right, the ANSI C standard is introduced. Extension to the language C, right? That is C with classes, right? The corresponding year is 1979, right? In 1979, the object-oriented feature of Simula. Since we have seen that, right? What is Simula? Simulation language, that is an object-oriented programming language. The object-oriented features of Simula and the structured features of C, right, are combined into a new language, that is C with classes. The language C with classes, right, is designed by John Stroustrup. John Stroustrup initially, right, designed the language by combining the features of a Singular and a C language, right? So called as a C with classes. Later, right, in 1983, right, the language C with the classes is renamed to C++. C++, right, is said to be one of the object-oriented programming language, right? This is, of course, the partially object-oriented programming language. Because without having the concepts of object-oriented programming, we can write a C++ program, right? Similar to a C language program. For example, hash include iostream.h. No need to introduce the class concepts, right? So you can directly write a main function, right? Then within the opening and closing curly braces, right? You can write the statements similar to a C language, right? So without the top down, without the bottom up programming approach, similar to the top down programming approach, right? We can write a code for a C++. That's what C++ is said to be the partially object-oriented programming language. Then from 1980s to 1990s, right, gave the birth to, right, the pure object-oriented programming language Java, right? So the foundations are, right, introduced, right, in that period 1980s to 1990s, right? So the concepts of, right, object-oriented programming, right, are introduced in 1991 at Sun Microsystems Incorporation. Sun Microsystems Incorporation, right? Some team members are there, right? James Gosling, then Patrick Norton, Chris Watt, Ed Frank, Mike Sheridan. These people initially, right, designed a language called Vogue. They spent, right, 1.5 years, right, in completing the first working version of the language called Vogue. Right? James Gosling, Patrick Norton, Chris Watt, Ed Frank, Mike Sheridan, right? Initially designed a language Vogue, right? They spent, right, almost, right, 1.5 years, right, to complete the first working version of a language called Vogue. In 1995, the language Vogue was renamed to Java. To be, right, the internet programming language, but the important point is Java is not actually designed for internet applications. The designer's aim of Java was, right, or to achieve a platform independent language, to achieve or to design a platform independent, that is architecture neutral language. Architecture neutral language. So in 1995, right, the language Vogue was renamed, right, and the team members, right, achieved, right, the platform independent or architecture neutral language called Java. This is the brief history of Java language. So different, right, modern programming, right, strategies are introduced, right? Say modular programming, right? Structured programming, object-oriented programming, right? A pure object-oriented programming, right? So the birth to Java, right, is taken from, right, the features of, right, C++. object-oriented features of C++ and right of course the structured features of C right are completely taken right into the design of pure object-oriented programming language Java. Structured versus object-oriented programming, right? Structured language means a language which supports sequence, selection, iterative constructs, right? Object-oriented programming, this is another kind of problem-solving methodology for some real-world problems. When the complexity in solving a real-world problem increases, right? Structured programming, right, will have certain restrictions or limitations. So to resolve that, right, we need to have the object-oriented programming language. In structured programming, right, the entire focus is given in terms of functions, right, the structures. Where in case of object-oriented programming, the entire focus is given in terms of objects as well as classes. Structured programming follows top-down programming approach, right? So top-down programming approach in the sense that main function is designed, right, or defined at the beginning of the code. Following the main function, right, we need to define the corresponding user-defined functions. Since the program execution begins at the main function, right? So at the top of the program, right, program execution begins, right? So structured programming concepts are said to be top-down programming approach, where object-oriented programming, right? In object-oriented programming, for example, right, in C++, right, we need to define the header file first, then define the class functions, right? Class declaration and class functions. Following that, right, at the bottom of the code, right, you need to define the main function where you need to create the objects, right? Objects are responsible for calling the member functions. Since the main function is placed at the bottom of the program, right, from there, control is going to call the corresponding member functions in the top and the bottom up direction. That's what the C++ is said to be a bottom up programming language. So in general, right, object-oriented programming languages, right, follow bottom-up programming approach. So following right the structure versus object-oriented programming, right? Then the stage has been set for Java, right? So in 1991, right, the people designed the initial language book, right? After that, in 1995, right, the language book has been extended, right, to meet the entire functions of right object-oriented programming principles, so that the language is renamed as Java. Java is one of the important language for internet applications. In general, Java is not designed to solve the internet problems, internet applications. Their aim was right, simply to design the platform independent or architecture neutral language. Right. However, right, the platform independent or architecture neutral language, right, completely changed the concept of right internet, and this is applicable for right internet applications. That's what the language Java is said to be, right, the C++ version of internet or internet version of a C++ language. So extending the concepts of C++ with respect to internet applications, right, the language right Java fits to solve the corresponding real world applications. Using Java, right, we can design right two kinds of right. We can design two kinds of programs. One is a Java application, and another one is the Java applet. Right. Using Java, what we can design means we can design two kinds of programs. One is Java application, and another one is Java applets. Java can be used to design right two kinds of programs. One is the application program. Second one is the applet program. Application program is a program which is similar to right a C or C++ application. which can have right any number of right LOC, right lines of code, right 10,000 lines of code or 5,000 or 50 LOC, right whatever it is. Applet is concerned, right? Applet is nothing but a small program, right? Applet is a small program compared to right application program, right? LOC, right? Maybe right very minimal, right? So applet is a small program, right? Which are transported, right? Which are transported right over the internet, right? And the applets are right executed by the corresponding browser, right? Say applet viewer or Internet Explorer, Netscape Navigator, right, etc. The small programs, right, which are executed by, right, the corresponding browsers are said to be applet programs. So using Java, right, we can design, right, these two kinds of programming, right, application programming and applet programming. Applet programming, right, do not have the corresponding main method. Main method is only to be placed inside the application program. Applets, right, do not have main method. So Java applets, right, this is important, right? And later we will see, right, how to design, right, the applet programming, right? In internet, right, there are different kinds of objects, right? Those objects are said to be, right, cyberspace objects. In a cyberspace, different objects are moving from one location to another location, right? Since the cyberspace consists of, right, object space, right? Objects are responsible for, right, moving from one location to another location, right, in order to execute, right, and achieve the required task. For example, in the case of cyberspace, right, and internet applications, right, there are two, right, different categories of objects are transmitted, right, over the internet. So two different objects that are transmitted, right, in a cyberspace are, right, one is the passive information and the second one is the dynamic active programs, right? Passive information means which is not an active one. For example, if you want to download an applet, if you want to download a Java program, right, application program or applet programming, that stage, right, the status of your program, that is not an active one. So you are downloading the passive code, passive information. In case if you are executing the applet code, right, so that stage what will happen means applets are responding to the corresponding user inputs. So applets are simply nothing but GUI based environment, right? GUI in the sense that, right, graphical user interface, graphical user interface. GUI based features are supported in the applet programming language. When we download, right, the applet, right, and we execute the applet, right, at that stage, right, what will happen means, right, the status of your applet is a dynamic one as well as an active one, right? So since in the internet, different objects are, right, moving from one location to another location, right? Simply for example, if we take two different machines, right, one is a client machine and another one is a server machine. What a client will do, client will give a request to the server, right? For example, right, we do want to access, right, www.sastra.edu, right? So from the client machine, right, you will be giving the request to the server, right? Then the server responds, right? For example, we can type the username and the password, right, after entering your URL. Then you need to press enter, submit, right? Pressing the submission, right, what will happen means the username and the password, right, will be sent to the server, right? The server validates the corresponding username and the password. Then if the login is successful, you will be redirected to the corresponding login page. Otherwise what will happen means the server, right, validates, right, the check of your username and the password, assuming that, right, if any of the credentials, right, are wrong, right, then what will happen means, right, the corresponding error message is going to be displayed, right? So this is happening, right, in case of a client as well as, right, server side environments, right? So because of that, right, Java is said to be, right, a professional programmer's language, right, and Java is said to be internet programming language, right? Java is Java is the internet programming language. Java is also a professional programmer's language. Professional programmer's language. Java is an object-oriented programming language, or we can say a pure object-oriented programming language, right? So simply, right, Java is a high level, right, a pure object-oriented, a professional programmers and internet programming language.